Coming up on Regarding Men, Confessions of a Bigot. Well, hello and welcome to Regarding Men, a place where we hold men in high regard and a place where, I'll see what I can do, a place where red pill isolation comes to die. Let's try one more thing. There it is. Red pill isolation comes to die, and indeed it does. And I'm here today with Janice Fiamingo of the Fiamingo Files, who I hold in very high regard, and Mr. Paul Elam from paulelam.com, who I also hold in very high regard. Two people who come up with ideas about men's issues that I'd never thought of. Anyway, today we're going to talk about Confessions of a Bigot. Confessions of a Bigot. What the heck are we talking about? Well, let me tell you a story. There's a woman whose name is, let's see if I can find her name. It won't come up. There we go. Lee Burdett Williams. Lee Burdett Williams wrote this article about her experience as a dean of students at a college in Vermont. And in the article, she talks about she was invited to this workshop, to do a workshop, a speech at a place that was put up by a FACE. You guys know FACE? They are a great organization. Families advocating for campus equality. And they've been working at it since at least 6 or 7 years, working at trying to understand and trying to change all of the crap that's going on where due process is cut off for young men. And they've got all these mothers and fathers who are working together to try and change this Dear Colleague letter, which indeed happened there for a while, and now it's going to get changed back, it looks like, who knows. But it's a great organization, a red-pilled organization, I would say. And this college dean was invited to speak at their conference. And she'd been involved in sexual assault and litigating that on a college campus, right? So they thought, well, maybe she can offer us some ideas about things, because they read an article that she had written about her experience. And oh boy, in the article, let's see, let me give you a little taste of what she says. Here she talks about when she got a hold of that letter, the Dear Colleague letter from Obama. I read the letter, nodding at some parts and shaking my head at others. It felt like a group of well-intended but misinformed interlopers had shown up to tell me how to do a job I'd done for years. Okay, let's stop right there. She is looking at the Dear Colleague letter, which literally takes away the due process rights of young men. And she's thinking of it in terms of she's getting insulted by a group of people coming in and telling her what to do. She is shaking her head and nodding that due process rights of men should be taken away. So that's the first indication that, oops, something might be wrong. Why did this happen? There were institutions that had not treated their students well, and quite possibly there were some incompetent people at the helm of those institutions. But, oh my gosh. And she goes on to say, then the Obama administration began a well-meaning,
Yeah, right.
but relatively shallow campaign to hold institutions accountable, and momentum built. Everyone was talking about sexual assault on campus, an outcome any dean of students would have been grateful for in the past. What? But the lines had been drawn, and somehow we ended up as targets of enmity instead of comrades in this important battle. Now, do you see what she's doing there? She's setting herself up as being the victim.
Yeah.
She's saying, they're attacking me. When she's completely missing the fact that she's got a problem here. She's got what's called acceptable prejudice. Anybody ever heard of acceptable prejudice before? Oh boy, you will soon enough. I'm going to do a video on it soon, and I bet Regarding Men's going to do more than one on it because it's very important. Acceptable prejudice is the research has shown now that sometimes in cultures, certain groups are set to have what they call acceptable prejudice. That means that you can discriminate against them, and that's okay. It's not really a problem, you know? And that's what this woman is experiencing. And to make matters worse, I don't think she even knows it. She has no idea that she's prejudiced. She has no idea that she's a bigot. You know, I've thought so many times about what is the mind, what's going through the minds of people who are feminists, you know, who just come up to you and spout this stuff about how, you know, men shouldn't have rights. I'm thinking, what's going through their mind? And this is exactly what's going through their mind. It's the acceptable prejudice. And there's this great thesis, doctoral thesis by a psychologist on the whole deal with acceptable prejudice and how it impacts men. So we'll be talking more and more about that as we go along. But right now, just as in the 1950s, when there was overt racism in many places around the country, people had this acceptable prejudice. They had a prejudice that was encouraged by the culture, that was encouraged by the media, encouraged by academia even, you know? And the same thing is true with men today. You know, discrimination against men is encouraged by all of those groups. And so people think, oh, well, that should be just fine and dandy, right? Oh, boy. One of the things the psychologist says in his thesis is that, you know, he wants psychologists to understand this whole idea of acceptable prejudice. And one of the things they need to understand is that that they themselves may have this, and they need to see how they are denying it. They are trivializing it, or they are justifying that prejudice. That's exactly what we need to teach people. That's exactly what we need to help people see. How do you help someone understand that they're trivializing or denying this prejudice against men? Anyway, let's go to the full story about what's happening with our friend Lee Burdett Williams when she comes and does this conference for FACE. Guys, where do we go from here?
Well, yeah, it's a good case study, I think, of acceptable prejudice and how
Yes.
hard it is for those who are in its grips to recognize it, because she
Yes.
writes a whole follow-up article. So it's got kind of complicated in terms of her articles. She wrote one article in 2015, I believe,
Yes.
talking about why she quit her job as dean of students. And it was all about, not because she was disgusted by the miscarriage of justice that she was seeing on college campuses, which one might, hope and expect. It was because she felt that she had become, administrators like her were being victimized, that they were the targets of anger, of this politicized process, and it was very difficult. I mean, like so many academics, especially academics who work their way into the bureaucracy of academia, it's all about them. They see themselves as, particularly intelligent and empathetic, yet they are so closed off to other people's real experiences that they think receiving angry emails from mothers whose sons have been expelled from school after a ridiculous process in which the son never even got to see the evidence against him and to respond to it. They think that in that experience, they're the ones who are primarily suffering. So she writes this article, FACE, she resigns, steps down from her position as dean of students. FACE invites her to this conference in the year 2016, and now this article is published in the year 2021 in the Chronicle of Higher Education, talking about her experience at the FACE conference. And essentially what happened there was that it was very uncomfortable for her. She stood up and gave a prepared speech, and about a third of the way into the speech, or maybe even before she started giving it, she realized it was completely inappropriate for this audience. She had not really understood what FACE is. She had never thought about the experience of being a parent of a son railroaded in a campus tribunal process. She had never considered really what it's like for those young men. Never in all. She had been an administrator for 25 years. And it was not until she arrived at this conference and started giving her talk, or even before then when she listened to what other people had to say, that she began to see things from the other side.
Yes. She has blinders on, it's just like blinders. You just can't see. You're only seeing this much.
She had at least a cursory understanding of what FACE was going into this. She knew that they were concerned with due process and the false allegations and things like that. But she had such arrogance and privilege going into this. She actually thought she would go to this audience who were people whose lives had been destroyed by these policies on campus and really explain to them how she and her cohorts were really good and well-intentioned individuals that were doing the best job they could with what they have. And the audience threw that back in her face.
I hope so.
And she got her privilege shoved right back at her.
And
it did not, unfortunately, if you read the article, she seems to, on some level, I think the way, like, a fly sitting on a boulder is somehow connected to the idea that there may be something larger than it out there somewhere. And I think that's about the level that she had insight she had into this. And you can see in her writing about this the overwhelming sense of privilege, and you can see that she never really truly got what happened when she made that presentation.
Yes.
And just how offensive and hurtful that it was to people who have been harmed by this. And the quotes on this, she starts like with this thing that Tom just put up when she's asking about FACE. She says, is it a legit group or one of those scary men's rights groups that live on the fringes of the incel world? I mean, this is straight out of, quotes I pulled out of my ass.
Yes.
This is one of the first ones in that book. And she's setting up the stage there that mostly people who talk about this stuff are just scary, hateful people. Otherwise, why would they question her work? They must be terrible people.
Right.
And so she's figuring out how to rationalize that maybe these people she's talking to are perhaps a little less repulsive than the likes of Tom, Janice, and Paul.
I had no interest in aligning myself with the nut jobs out there who think all feminists hate men, who think sexual assault survivors deserved what happened to them, who contribute to a culture of misogyny and violence. All feminists hate men? Yep. I'll go along with that.
Well, and the
Washington Post says so.
The Washington Post says so.
Survivors deserved what happened to them. I've been in the men's movement for a long time, and I have yet to hear any MRA ever utter any kind of sentiment like that whatsoever.
No.
No.
Never.
It's awful. The cardboard phraseology, as George Orwell said in Politics in the English Language, when you see that kind of cardboard prefabricated phrasing, you know you are in the vicinity of somebody who is not thinking.
Yes.
She's merely repeating, these prefabricated phrases, and we all do it. I'm guilty of it too at times when you're speaking and you're fumbling around for your words. This is an essay she wrote about her experience. She obviously gave it very careful thought, and she lumps all men's rights groups into this crude category of people deserving absolutely no respect or consideration. And when I first read that, given the title of the article, How Much Damage Have My Colleagues and I Done? I thought perhaps she was engaging in self-parody. I thought perhaps there was a bit of irony there, a discrepancy between the writing self and the person that she's writing about. But when you read the whole article, unfortunately, that is not the case. She is not writing in order to show how little she understood.
Right.
Because by the end of the article, she understands almost nothing more. She's, as Paul said, she's maybe, she's had a glimmer of a larger perspective.
It's
But it
all about
certainly,
her.
it's all about her. It's this piece is narcissism in practice. It's all about how she suffered because she spent a few uncomfortable hours at a conference and was able to escape at the end, never has to see these people again, never has to deal with their perspectives, but she thinks that's enough and that that's worthy of being written about, as if she were some sort of heroine for having gone through this.
Yes.
It's well, I really encourage everybody to read it, because although it's painful, it's helpful to see the strength of the blinders that this feminist academic is still wearing, even 30 years into this experience.
Yes. It really helped me to see how the blinders were there and how potent they were. And it's understandable to a degree how she could think that men's rights activists were nut jobs, considering she has such a narrow view of the world. I mean, it's like this narrow little view that doesn't take into anything outside her own little world. It's crazy.
Yeah.
And I know something, I'll give her that, Tom. I really will. Because, if we're going to be honest, if you look at, say, the members of FACE,
Yeah.
these are people, for the most part, we know this. These are people that were going along happily go lucky in life without any clue whatsoever of what was going on, and didn't care about it until it happened to their child, until it happened to their son or their brother. And now they're understandably full of outrage. But the whole world has these blinders on. It's why we can have policies like Dear Colleague Letter, and very rarely, unless somebody like Trump comes along, they're never challenged seriously by anybody, because for the most part, the world doesn't wonder how much damage her and her colleagues have done. And I would like to answer her question. Madam, your colleagues and you have done a horrific amount of damage over the years to countless people, and you've done it with no consequence whatsoever to yourself. And please quit belly aching about the fact that a few people at a conference didn't want to hear your bullshit, and told you so. That doesn't make you a victim. The young men who have been robbed of due process, robbed of their educational futures, robbed of their security in life because of your work, those guys are the victims. They absolutely are. You're not.
Amen.
Yeah, it is a really stunning testimony to her inability to really grasp the magnitude of the issue, even when she sits through a conference where parents speak of their grief. 5 young men actually, testified, I guess to use that word, at the conference about their experience and what it felt like to be hauled before a tribunal where you knew that everybody was inclined to think of you as guilty, and where in fact the procedure is set up so that you are understood to be guilty until you can prove your innocence, and you're not given an opportunity, a fair one, to prove your innocence anyway. She sat there and listened to all that, and it didn't really matter. She had a little flash. Maybe we could look at a couple of the paragraphs, Paul, where she talks about how she had this disorienting experience of seeing things from a different perspective, but it didn't fundamentally penetrate. Here it is. She says, at the start of the first session the next morning, I took my place in the middle of a row of chairs and settled in as anonymously as I could. She's already had as she describes it, uncomfortable encounter with 2 mothers, a lesbian couple, I assume, whose son had one of these rotten experiences. And she describes how she felt they were quite rude to her when she clarified who she was. So she's already feeling a bit uncomfortable. And so she describes it. The morning sessions included a talk by the journalist Kathy Young. Interesting. I love the work of Kathy Young, although Kathy Young has certainly had very harsh things to say about men's rights advocates. And Kathy Young took on the concept of rape culture in a way that would have earned her a place on the hit lists of activists against campus sexual assault. It's kind of interesting how crudely she describes the animus of people who work, supposedly to deal with and redress the problem of campus sexual assault. This is indeed the attitude of feminist activists on campus. They put people on hit lists and go after them mercilessly.
Yep.
Anyway, she listens to Kathy Young. Obviously, she'd never read Kathy Young before. Kathy Young has written about these issues very insightfully with mounds of data about the number of men wrongly, expelled from school, the successful lawsuits that they have launched. Young has described the horrors of the lack of due process under the Obama era's Dear Colleague manifesto. And wouldn't this woman have read some of this stuff on her own before she came to this meeting, when she was in fact in charge of these tribunals? Like, her ignorance is just stunning. So anyway, so she hears Kathy Young for the first time. Her premise was that our campuses have been overrun by second wave feminists, no kidding, who have turned their academic passions into incubators of activism. As she spoke, I imagined the faces of my former faculty colleagues, smart, capable, committed feminists who indeed create in their classrooms, if not incubators, something of a neonatal ICU for their students' own passions. So she's admitting right there that as she thinks about her colleagues, she knows they are all feminist activists. Those are the people in charge of these tribunals, all feminist activists whose ideology demands that men be found guilty. Let's go to the next paragraph. Her inability to accept that this could be true. It had never occurred to me that others might condemn their efforts. And as I listened, the counter-narrative came into focus as though I were twisting a camera lens. What if Young had a point? What if these feminist warriors, women in their 50s, 60s, 70s, had taken their academic research, which, as we've found over and over again, is completely flawed and biased, had taken their academic research, turned it into experiential learning, and in doing so tilted the playing field toward the students, mostly young women, who took their classes. It was no coincidence, Young claimed, that the rise of women's studies programs on college campuses coincided with the arrival of women's centers and victims advocate services. So she's never considered this before. I mean, this is truly amazing that the person tasked for 25 years with overseeing these tribunals has never considered that putting feminist advocates in charge of this process might have disastrous outcomes for the accused men. And, and this is not something that started in 2010 or 2011 when the Dear Colleague letter came out, as she claims. This has been going on. Daphne Patai has a book called Heterophobia, published in 1998, which is about how this started in the 1980s. It has been going on for decades, and she oversaw it and thought she was doing a great job because she was interested in listening and working collaboratively. And she was so convinced that she was one of the good guys, bringing an end to the grief of sexual assault survivors. And even listening to the stories of the men who were railroaded does not fundamentally change her perception of herself. It's incredible.
Yeah, this is someone who is living in a female bubble. It's a bubble that does not allow in anything about men. It's only, and she goes on to say in the article that she started women's studies at one of the universities somehow, and women's
she
centers.
Started a women's
so
center.
This is her world. This is her bubble, literally. I mean, this really helps me to understand that this is because her entire existence is based on this bubble. And it's a bubble that
I think it's interesting to point out, too, this is just my 2 cents, just my opinion, but I think she and Kathy Young share some of the same issue with that. Kathy Young, I agree with Janice, she does some great work. I've been reading her stuff for years, does a lot of great research. but she tends to get offended when men want to speak up. Us uppity men want to speak up for our own issues, and
Mhm.
because of course Kathy is supposed to be the mouthpiece for all this. It needs to be in a
Yeah.
woman's hands, and I think
Yeah.
it's the same gynocentrism. This story also reminds me of, I don't know if you guys recall Judith Grossman,
Oh,
who was
yes.
a card carrying, Cosmo subscribing feminist for years and years and years. Her son was ridiculously accused by a girlfriend that he
Oh,
had broken up with, who came back months or maybe even years
right.
later, made us an accusation. And all of a sudden, Judith Grossman is outraged at what's been going on. She just then noticed, oh, there's maybe a problem here. And
Mhm.
we were supposed to be all impressed with her new insights. Um,
Hmm.
I'm not.
Yeah.
I mean, this woman is revealing her ignorance all the way through this poorly crafted article. I mean, if she wanted to expose herself as a bigot, this is what she would write, and I think
Yes.
she did an
Yes.
amazing job of it.
I agree. I
Yeah.
agree. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't even know if we need to look at the last paragraphs that we had, had excerpted there, because it's really just more of the same. She justifies what she comes to see as the potential unfairness of the process by claiming that it was so unfair before. If only we had listened before. If
Oh
only
God.
there hadn't been decades and
That part really
decades
got me.
of yeah, if only we hadn't been such misogynists, if only there hadn't been this history of women's concerns not being listened to, women not being heard on college campuses when they're raped. And we know that there's a very widespread problem of sexual assault on all campuses all across North America. I mean, this is not true. She never provides any evidence for it. There is no evidence for it. In fact, there was concern about women's experiences and women's complaints dating well back into the early days of the feminist movement. As feminists came onto campus, there's no reliable evidence that sexual assault on campus has ever been a particular problem. In fact, women are very, very safe, as studies show, safer there than in the larger community by far. And and even that argument, like even accepting, let's imagine that in the 1960s, let's say, that women's complaints of sexual assault were not listened to on college campuses, why that would justify the mass unfairness of the treatment of men today. And that's just collective vengeance. And it's a feature of feminist thinking that is particularly reprehensible. And why this woman thinks that she and her academic colleagues, with their little flimsy degrees in women's studies and sociology and English literature and art history and religious studies, why she thinks they would be equipped to investigate and adjudicate claims of sexual assault in the first place. She doesn't even consider that.
Nope.
Why did she think that she or any of her feminist advocate friends were equipped to investigate these stories and to interview witnesses and to weigh competing accounts and to come to conclusions when they know nothing about legal procedure? They know nothing about how to gather evidence or how to come to conclusions about it. She never even considers that in the
Correct.
story. She just ends with this kind of, and the piece ends completely inconclusively with her saying, oh, well, I'm out of it now. I doubt we'll ever get it right. Yeah, no kidding, because you're not equipped to get it right. And it shouldn't be going on campus at all. If a woman is
Exactly.
raped on campus or off,
Police.
she should go to the police.
Yes.
Hello.
What?
Your vagina is not a badge, and I think she gets the two confused.
Yeah. Yeah, she's
Oh
still full
God.
of that righteousness
Yes.
that somehow, because she's a woman with empathy, that this is something she and her feminist allies should do. And it's just incredible. At one point, one of the parents complained about seeing all of the people involved in her son's tribunal leaving the university together, walking together, laughing. She said she investigated them. She found they were all Facebook friends. They were going out to dinner together after they had, ruined a man's life.
Yep.
They all attended a wedding together. And,
Yep.
this woman was outraged that this was supposed to be some sort of impartial investigation when clearly it was nothing of the sort. And Lee Burdett Williams says, well, that's true. I never thought about how it would look. But she stops. She realizes, it probably looked bad, but she never considers that it actually was bad. Right. And that's it. She, at the end of all of this, nothing has changed for her. She's not interested in men's experience. She's not campaigning to change the tribunal system. She's not campaigning to have it taken out of universities altogether. She's not asking for men to come forward and tell the stories of the abuse that they have suffered. She couldn't care less. She thinks she's paid her debt by writing this essay all about her suffering.
She doesn't even see it. It doesn't come in her biocomputer that men might have problems. Think of Archie Bunker. I loved Archie Bunker, but he was the same way. Archie was the same way. He was a sweet man in a lot of ways, but he simply had a very narrow viewpoint, where he couldn't see outside of his own way of looking at the world. And that's what we see with this woman. And I think Paul's kind of brought up the idea that, one of the things that helps people to see is when it happens to them. And we see that all the time regarding men, with the men who understand the red pill now are there because they got screwed. They got lambasted by the family courts or by whoever. So it makes me wonder, maybe we shouldn't start falsely accusing all these people.
God, it'd be hard to come up with an accusation that wasn't true about some of them.
That's so true.
I think the fundamental problem here is like it always is with pathological gynocentrism. This woman does not have a starting point that includes recognition of men as human beings.
Right.
That's the problem here.
Right.
There is no acceptance whatsoever that they're anything but an object to be manipulated.
Believe the woman.
Yep.
Believe the woman. That's her space. That's her consciousness, is believe the woman, and doesn't go any farther than that. So it really helps me to understand at least that much, to understand what's going on with that. And I really do think that this whole deal with the acceptable prejudice is going to be an important thing for men's rights people to have as something in their pocket. They're going to be able to pull that out and say, you have acceptable prejudice. And people are going to go, what? Yeah, baby, because it's true. So true. She's filled with acceptable prejudice. She's filled with it. She doesn't even know it. She has no concept of it. Time to wake up.
And a time to recognize that as a red pill individual for myself, her bigotry is not acceptable to me.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
It is not acceptable in my world. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, there's a lot more actually to say about this woman, but I think we would be just probably flogging a dead horse.
There is one thing.
What's that?
I think she qualifies for a flying puta.
We haven't had one of those for a long time.
We haven't had a puta, and I'm sorry to say, Lee Burdett Williams, you do qualify for a puta in your well, not quite, but
Paul, you did it again.
Anyway,
are we doing the burning puta now?
Oh God, I don't know.
Anyhow, doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter. There's
there she is.
There goes Lee Burdett. There she went.
Mm-hmm. Anyway, I definitely encourage people to take a look at that essay as just a really, I found it pretty dispiriting actually to read. Somebody who thinks the scales have fallen from her eyes and that she now sees something clearly, but really she doesn't really seem to see anything clearly at all, and has emerged completely unscathed even in her own conscience from the years she was involved in this atrocious injustice against we don't know how many hundreds of wrongly accused men who
And-
never even had a chance to defend themselves properly and had their lives ruined, weren't able to complete college, had everything derailed.
And I agree with you completely, Janice. But to me, it was helpful because it really gave me a sense of the confessions of a bigot. I mean, it literally was the confessions of a bigot, like the title says. I mean, and the other thing about this article you might want to know, guys, is that you're going to have to sign up for Chronicle in order to see the whole thing.
Yeah.
I think it's a free account, but
It is free.
Yeah.
You only have to register. You don't have to
Yeah.
subscribe.
yeah,
It's
Yeah, you can-
if you want to spend 20 minutes looking at one of the best exercises in self-deception I've ever seen.
yes,
You can
yes.
read that article.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Well, on that sort of downbeat note.
Oh, what do you mean, downbeat?
Yeah, we did get a puta out of this, so that's good.
A what?
We got a puta like that, and we also happen to know that men
Are. I think we lost Tom.
Good.
we didn't. Tom,
He was waiting for the puta to finish. That little teeny puta was flying in the air. I wanted to wait until she finished her little path.
Oh,
And I figured nobody's going to interrupt me, so I'll just wait.
There you go. Guys, come join us at Regarding Men.
Indeed. We're having a good time.
Hello.
Exciting news coming up. Exciting news coming up, hopefully within the next month or so. We'll see.
okay, guys.
You all take care. We'll see you then.
Have a great week.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.